welcome to OSHA's Hurricane Response and Recovery webinar. My name is Jim Brock, and I'm the Director of Training Programs and Administration within OSHA's Office of Training and Education. Today, OSHA has partnered with our OSHA Training Institute Education Center at the University of California, San Diego to offer this webinar. The OSHA Training Institute Education Center program is a national network of 25 nonprofit organizations across the country that OSHA has authorized to deliver occupational safety and health training on our behalf. So we were fortunate to be able to enlist the assistance of our friends at UCSD for today's events. All participants are in a listen-only mode, meaning your microphone will be muted. Should you have any questions during today's webinar, please type them into the chat. We will reserve some time following the presentation to answer questions from the chat. Today's presentation will simultaneously be translated into Spanish. Instructions for receiving that translation are provided in the chat. Our instructor today is Joaquin Diaz, who is a safety professional with 25 years of environmental health and safety experience, currently serving as the Global Construction EHS Manager for Microsoft. Additionally, Joaquin has served as an instructor at the OTI Education Center at UCSD for 18 years. Joaquin's also lived in Miami and Hawaii, where he's gained some personal experience in the response efforts we will be discussing today. Thank you all for joining us today, and at this point, I'll turn it over to Joaquin.
Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate the opportunity and the introduction. This is a critical topic, considering what we've all experienced in the past couple months with hurricanes making landfall and having a significant impact to the areas that the hurricanes have crossed over to. My first experience with a hurricane happened in '92 with Hurricane Andrew. That was actually the first hurricane that made landfall as long as I was alive uh, to the South Florida region. And of course, as time has gone on, it seems like a hurricane has become a hurricane warning to the state of Florida has become an annual recurrence, unfortunately. And so we're going to talk about the disaster recovery efforts that are generally made and some of the common hazards that come from that kind of work. What is missing in here, though, just as the first image shows, is the human impact that disaster recovery has, the impact to not only the individual seeking recovery and seeking support in a disaster, but also for the responders themselves, the things that they experience, that they see, that they have to work through, can have a taxing impact to their own mental and physical well-being. So that's something else that we have to consider is the soft side of disaster recovery, not just the physical hazards. So the agenda today, we're going to talk a little bit about hurricanes very briefly. We're going to talk through some preparedness and planning, immediate response efforts, and this is where the meat of our conversation is going to lie. It's going to lie with the hazards that recovery efforts can create and people can encounter as they're trying to work through and trying to make the community whole again. We'll talk briefly about the recovery process and then the long-term strategies. Now, the long-term strategies are things that come from local policy decisions, not so much from an environmental health and safety uh, perspective, but more just how we can strengthen our communities to be more resilient towards a storm. And you could apply this logic to everything. You could apply it to tsunamis, which I encountered living in being stationed in Japan, as well as living in Hawaii for several years. We encountered tsunami warnings, earthquake activities, hurricanes, tornadoes, you name it. We uh, we as an organization or as a community need to understand what those threats are and how can we sustain ourselves. Um, Now, so let's talk real briefly about hurricanes. Let me just back up here. So there's an organization in the government called the National Climate Assessment, and they looked at hurricanes and they've studied them for a long time. So the intensity, I just have to say, the intensity, frequency, and duration of North Atlantic hurricanes, the ones that we encounter, as well as the frequency of the strongest types of hurricanes, 4 and 5. When we talk about Andrew, Andrew was a Category 5 when it made landfall, and it was a very destructive hurricane to South Florida. And as hurricanes, start approaching the mainland of the U.S., they can encounter obstacles on their approach and generally weaken, especially if they are crossing an island or even the state of Florida. If there's a cross, they get weaker and then they make impact like Katrina did in 2005. It was not a category 4 or 5 when it made landfall. But the frequency of these types of hurricanes have increased since the early 1980s. Now, according to the National Climate Assessment, the relative contributions of human and natural causes, so climate change, to these increases are still not understood. There are still questions about whether or not the climate change and whether or not human impact or natural impact have increased the intensity and the frequency of hurricanes. So that is a question that we don't have an answer to at the moment. But as we gain more knowledge about historical evidence of hurricanes, then maybe we can understand what the climate impact has been. All right, so we have hurricane formations. In here it talks about forming over warm ocean waters, but again, using the National Climate Assessment, they said that hurricane development is influenced by more than just sea surface temperature. There are other things like particulate matter in the air, atmospheric responses to a hurricane that can influence the strength or the weakening of that particular storm. So it's not just as easy as saying, okay, it's forming over the Atlantic. The Atlantic is warmer, it's more shallow, it's going to be a strong hurricane. There are other things that influence the formation of that particular storm. And then the categorization, we characterize the hurricanes based on its destructive force, the wind speeds and the potential storm surges, which the current storms had larger storm surges than what other storms may generate, and also create heavy rainfall. One thing about Andrew, in my own experience, is that it wasn't a truly wet hurricane. It was relatively dry compared to other storms, but the winds were devastating to the South Florida region. So and you look at Katrina, for example, when it made landfall in Louisiana, it wasn't a very powerful storm, but it created enough devastation with flooding and to impact the city of New Orleans for a very long time. So that's the general characteristics of storms. All right, so classification and naming. Again, they use wind speeds to classify the storms using a scale called the Saffir-Simpson scale. Uh, don't need to get into the particulars of how that scale works, but just understand that it's based on wind speed. And then the naming conventions. It's easier to identify a storm by a name like Andrew or Wilma or Helene. Um, then it would be to use other characters or other naming conventions. So using standard names that we can all relate to helps us to recall the storm response, as well as learn from those particular storms. All right. I've just mentioned, there have been, storms throughout history that have had a significant impact to a community. So our goal is to understand how these storms impact those particular communities. What are the vulnerabilities? Which regions are most prone to storms? And then prepare effectively for those storms to make landfall. And when they do landfall, have an adequate response to that storm's impact. And generally, we can kind of name off easily what those responses, well, what generally gets impacted in a storm. It's the electrical power distribution. That generally gets impacted. Safe drinking water will get impacted. Sewage and the ability to dispose of human waste, that also becomes an impact. And then of course food delivery and things of that nature because of the infrastructure impact. If you don't have electrical power, then you really can't have refrigeration unless you're on a backup system. So these are the kind of things we can learn from and have an effective logistics response to those. But again, our concern are the hazards that are presented in a disaster recovery aspect. So I'm breezing through those because to me, the meat of the conversation today are about the hazards. All right, so preparedness. A lot of vulnerable areas have very good warning systems. They have very good forecasting systems. You may have, radar. You may have buoys. You know, uh, uh, storm planes that fly into the storm to kind of gain metrics from that. So there's a lot of good ways that we can accurately predict a hurricane's path and a hurricane's strength. Now, of course, the forecasting is exactly what it means. It's forecasting. It's not always as accurate as the estimates will show, and that's perfectly fine. But at least we have an idea of the storm's potential uh, 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 travel path so that we can have adequate preparations in place. The community preparation and engagement is also important. Your local community should have outreach programs that coordinate shelter response, food response, and then restoring the infrastructure. All of those should be part of that community engagement. But also you as a person living in a vulnerable area should always be prepared. So having a plan, having emergency supplies, and having a family response plan as well. What to do, how if you have pets, if you have vulnerable populations living in your home, how do you deal with those? How do you ensure you have enough medications? All of those things are critical to emergency preparedness. And then your workplace also they also have to have preparation. And so this next slide kind of talks through what your employer should consider and what you, if you're an EHS, environmental health and safety professional, should also consider. So having a plan that meets, the OSHA requirements to start with, first responders, first aid kits, things like that. But in addition to that is your contact list, having a plan to notify and contact employees during the emergency. Any updates and any impacts to your organization's facilities, equipment, machinery, whatever it may be, just having an ability to communicate with your employees during that emergency event is important. Okay. Help employees in understanding their shelter options. Understanding where are the safe areas that they can evacuate to. Now, fortunately, hurricanes give us long lead or long advance notifications. But other events do not have that. Earthquakes or tsunamis are generally created, and there's generally a short window to respond. So having a plan that talks about shelter in place, or even that describes where employees should meet for sheltering, and also having emergency stock in your offices. I know, like at my previous employer, I worked for a very large international contractor, and all of our offices had go bags, had emergency food, just for enough for our every occupant within the office to live on for 3 days. So those are just some examples of things your workplace can do. Also, if you work in an environment that has critical infrastructure or critical chemical processing or critical containment issues, you need to have shutdown protocols and critical operations maintenance procedures in place, because you don't want to have, let's say it's a refinery or a chemical plant, having a storm impacting those facilities and having fires or environmental contamination from those locations because you didn't have an adequate shutdown protocol or critical operations plan in place. So please look at that. Make sure you have it um, uh, um, in place, and you identify people that will be supportive of those critical ops. And then the other part to this is sustaining or continuity of operations. There's a whole field called business continuity that addresses continuity of your organization post-event. Because think about it, what if your IT services are down? What if your communication services are down? How can you adequately respond? And I worked for a contractor previously that was part of a callback list for emergency response to any events that occurred that impacted the community. So how do we get our heavy equipment up and running? How do we get our people to the locations to get the heavy equipment up and running? And how do we communicate with the client or with the state or the city that we were doing emergency response for to open up the roadways so that logistically products could get through to support the community. So all of those things you have to look at. How do we sustain or have continuity of our operations when the infrastructure is not in full operation? Okay, so then you have the immediate response efforts. You have the emergency response. Your ambulance services, your fire departments, your police departments. Then you may have the National Guard engagement. Then you have the incident command set up with FEMA and other government agencies. All of those are part of the emergency response to helping to find people that are in need, to help contain fires and ruptures of gas lines and things like that. So we have the emergency response elements. And then unfortunately we get into the rescue operations and attempting to save lives where people are trapped and what have you, and then triaging with the setup of mobile emergency facilities. You have the triaging that goes into it, and then unfortunately you get into the recovery mode where you have to seek those who unfortunately died or perished during a storm event. So those are the elements of this process. So, you have swift efforts to get in there and try to rescue people that need it. there are people that don't want to leave their homes during an emergency event. So we have to be mindful of that, and we have to start with those locations and try to get those people who are trapped by the storm or trapped by their arrangements. We have to try to get them rescued as well. So we're going into these life-saving efforts, and you may have the community also work to try to help rescue their companions, their community members. So you may see, paddle boats and things like that. People going out and trying to rescue others. So we have to deal with that human event too. It's the desire to help others. But when we're doing that in our desires, we also have to be mindful of the hazards that those people are going to encounter when they're trying to do their rescue operations. Okay, and then of course providing immediate relief and support. So getting food, water, and shelter to those communities. The American Red Cross and other organizations do a fantastic job in getting out there and trying to provide aid where necessary. And I do recall, put the politics aside, I do recall, the use of Starlink to, over the impacted communities in North Carolina and parts of Florida recently to help people have communication. So there are those things that are available in a community response or in relief. It's in the world we live in today, it's critical to have communication set up rapidly so that people can reach out to their family members, to their friends to see if they're okay, to see if they need any assistance. So having something like a Starlink or some other type of comparable process to get communications up is an important part of relief and support. All right, so let's talk about the hazards of concern, and there are many when it comes to response and recovery operations. So the crews encounter these challenges. They have to have a plan that when they encounter these challenges, what to do. Okay, we're going to have a lot of unknowns in a disaster response because again, we're dealing with a lot of instability. We're dealing with panicking humans. We're dealing with animals. We're dealing with harmful insects. We're dealing with a lot of different things, unstable structures, ruptures of utilities, things of that sort. So we have to be concerned about that. So what we've done is we've been able to organize these concerns using the OSHA Fatal 4 hazards. These are the things that unfortunately have that account for the most fatalities and injuries within the construction industry. And if we think about recovery and response, there are parallels to what we encounter within the construction industry. We also have to look at the chemical hazards related to the cleanup efforts. Think about 9/11, post 9/11, the cleanup efforts, and how many people were impacted by the pulverized building materials, whether it be asbestos or even lead or even the insulation used on the steel. All of those which contain fiberglass, all of those present new hazards that we may not be prepared for as a response and recovery crew. Okay, and we have to remember that safety is an important value, even if it's an emergency response in a harsh, rough, rushed environment like response and recovery. We still have to remember that safety is a value that we cannot compromise, not only for the recovery efforts and the crews that are doing the work, but also for the public, for the community that's been impacted. We have to ensure their safety. and the actions that we take in a response and recovery effort. So, what does that mean? That means effective pre-task planning. And like in an ICS situation and the incident command structure, there is a lot of effort on planning, on communication, on coordination, and those things have to take place. And we have to consider all potential hazards when we're looking at a response and recovery effort. So I'm just listing some of the we got the fatal four category, and in this case it's caught in and between. And then some of the common hazards that are related to this particular fatal four category. Confined spaces. You may not think that a confined space issue would be present in a response and recovery, but absolutely it is. When you have people trying to get into basement spaces or basements, crawl spaces, attics, those are confined spaces in general terms. Um, and so we have to be prepared for the hazards that come with that. Lockout, tagout, more particularly coordinating with utility owners and facility owners to ensure that there is effective control of energy. Flooding, demolition and cleanup, and trenching and excavation. So again, these are common caught in and between hazards that we have to be prepared for. So confined spaces. I'm pretty sure most of you understand the definition of a confined space. There's limited entry and exit, large enough for a person to enter and work, and not designed for continuous occupancy. Where can we find them in a recovery response realm? In pits, if we have to send people down, into pits or utility openings, manholes, handholds, sewers, whatever it may be. Those are concerns, or just even in pits or crawl spaces underneath a home. Basements, attic spaces, wall cavities. We wouldn't think of a wall cavity as being a potential confined space, but it absolutely is. So if we have to look at that as well. And then other types of cavities and crevices that you may find in structures. So based on that, should we consider permit entry? Absolutely, because you don't know what you're encountering. If you think about what OSHA defines as permit entry, or the conditions that they say would make a confined space a permit condition, would be hazardous atmospheres. We don't know what the chemical composition of the atmosphere is for that particular environment. Potential engulfment hazards if we have unstable soil within a pit, for example, if we have potential water infiltration. Trapping would be another one. Heat, it's hurricanes generally strike during the warmest times of the year. We're going to be encountering heat issues. And of course, if you're in a confined space, the heat is only magnified. So we have to look at that. And then we have to have preparation, safe entry gear, and ventilation and monitoring as necessary. So these are the things we have to consider for a confined space. Lockout, tagout. The key factor here is to control the hazardous energy sources. That's the key because you're most likely going to have ruptured gas lines. You're most likely going to have downed electrical utilities. And in most cases, they'll probably be de-energized, but you don't know. And so having a recovery and response crew understand that they do not approach electrical utilities, even if the assumption is that they are dead, there's no power running through them, you still should have coordination and control of the energy from that. And then water sources, ruptured water lines, sewer lines, what have you, those are concerns. So we have to coordinate with the utility regarding water sources. Okay, coordinate with these organizations, with the utility owners before any work is done near these utilities, regardless of your assumptions about it. Okay, flooding, post-storm flooding, as we saw with these recent storms, they did cause a lot of flooding concerns. So we have to consider protective systems that will attempt to mitigate or manage flooding issues. So sandbags, that's a general consideration. Shoring systems to support openings or pits or what have you, where we have to get inside and we want to control the flooding hazard. And then water rerouting, looking at how we can create temporary ponds or trenches that relocate water temporarily to flood water. We're not creating new canals or rivers for U.S. waterways. We're just deviating the water away from the flood waters, away from where we need to get in to safely respond. And then demolition and cleanup. You know, before any demolition work is done, before entry into structures are completed, we have to look at structural stability, making sure that we can send people inside. Also look at how we can safely disconnect utilities so that we can start raising structures that are unstable or that are no longer recoverable. Okay, we also have to consider proper equipment selection. So you don't want to use, sledgehammer to try to demolish a wall, because again, human energy, they're already exhausted, they're wearing a lot of gear. So if we can get proper heavy equipment in there to do the demolition work, that's the preference. And of course, keeping people out. You're going to have family members that are concerned about their properties, that want to get into their homes. If their homes are unsafe, we have to come up with a way to secure the site so that we can safely raise it. And then chemical exposure from building materials. You have treated lumber, you have insulation, which is generally fiberglass, which is an airborne hazard. You may have older homes that have lead paint. You may have asbestos from the thermal system insulation or the finishing insulation. So you have all of those things that you have to consider before you do demolition work. And then, of course, trenching and excavations. If we have to do any trench work, of course, selecting the right equipment to do it, but also utility locating, because the last thing you want to do is impact an already impacted infrastructure. You don't want to damage an electrical line, on an electrical underground utility line. You don't want to hit a gas line. You don't want to create more problems by the work that you have to do in the recovery efforts. So implement safe digging practices like potholing, which is basically surface digs to try to safely identify utilities, probing, which is similar to potholing, vacuum excavations, so using vacuum X equipment to do that, or hand digging. Hand digging is not the preferred method because again, you're putting a human in the way of a utility. So if they hit it with a shovel, they're the ones impacted. Okay, do recall that OSHA requires protection 5 feet or greater. However, shallow trenches and excavations can also be unstable, so we have to ensure that we adequately protect the excavation. And then identify other sources that could impact the trench and excavation and protective system stability. Provide safe access for those trenches and excavations, and also address hazardous atmospheres. It's a lot of water, there's a lot of foliage, there's a lot of things that have been disrupted. So we have to deal with the potential impacts of things like H2S and sulfur dioxide and things of that nature. So we gotta monitor that. Okay, now struck by and struck against, another category. The elements that we address in here are heavy equipment, chainsaws and tools, tree trimming, and work zone traffic safety. So heavy equipment, we should put our responders in high visibility clothing if they're working near equipment. We got to minimize the human and equipment interfacing. Okay, let the equipment do its job. You walking in those areas, can put yourself at risk and the operator at risk of hitting or striking a you or another person. So minimize that interaction, that interfacing with humans walking around heavy equipment. Manage public interaction. Homeowners are going to be interested, and they're already feeling a lot of different emotions, so they're going to want to get in there. But so we have to manage that public interaction and control that public interaction as much as possible. Ensure that we have competent operators and ground spotters that can effectively work together to minimize damage to the existing infrastructure and then minimize impact to humans by striking them. Protection of equipment from theft and vandalism. You're going to want people that want to borrow your equipment. So you got to have processes in place to secure your equipment, and then ensuring that all the equipment have functioning safety devices, movement alarms. So anytime the equipment reverses, does it alarm? Things of that nature. You need to make sure that you have those safety features operating. Chainsaws. Okay. Commonly misused. I don't know how many times I've seen chainsaw warriors out there attempting to cut through lumber, especially here in the Pacific Northwest. We have a lot of people that 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 use chainsaws for tree maintenance and what have you. They don't have the right PPE. You got to wear double eye protection. You got to wear chaps to protect your legs. You got to wear gloves, and there should be a two-hand control as much as possible, and then have a proper head protection. Now, the head protection does go in line with the double eye protection, which is a face shield and safety glasses. Ensure proper fuel levels, because the last thing you'd want is a chainsaw to stall as you're using it. It'll get stuck. It can create kickback issues. Ensure they got good chain tension, proper controls, bolted down and securely is bolted down securely onto the motor, and that the handles are in place. And maintain two-hand control as much as possible, and follow safe work practices. Like, do not start it while it's in between your legs, which does happen a lot. It is an effective warning that you'll find with these chainsaw manufacturers. So be mindful of that. And then tree trimming. Ensuring that there's zero energy in any utilities that cross through trees that have to be maintained post-storm, so it doesn't create a hazard. Use MEWPs as much as possible. Mobile elevating work platforms. Have those available where you can, and do tree trimming activities from that instead of having people climb trees to do work. Ladder use, I mean, it could be an unsafe environment for people to attempt to use a chainsaw or to cut trees from that. So use MEWPs where possible. Uh, Remove all hazards near the tree base, so any obstructions, anything that prevents you from safely cutting the tree, and then follow safe procedures when tree felling. Okay, work zone traffic safety, yes, because you're also dealing with people management, you're dealing with people driving vehicles near your areas, you have to ensure proper setup of work zones according to the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices from the Federal Highway Administration or state or local requirements. Ensure that you use proper signage where available and have trained flaggers, okay, with appropriate PPE and high visibility clothing. And do recall that high visibility clothing is based on the posted speed limit, the black and white speed limit of that particular location, that road or what have you. And then fall protection. Of course, we got to address fall protection. 6 foot height, it applies to all related activities. So 6 feet and, I know OSHA has differing requirements based on the activity, like steel erection, scaffolds, or what have you. But in an environment like this where we don't know what we don't know, we don't know what we're going to encounter. We don't know what what snakes in the grass hazards are present. We should apply a uniform standard for fall protection just to protect those who are doing the response and recovery efforts. Okay, there will be concerns about falls during surveys of structures and people searching. People are going to be climbing roofs and what have you. See what we can do to try to minimize that. Use technology like drones or what have you to kind of minimize people from climbing on top of things. Use of ladders, be mindful of ladder use and these responses and recovery activities. And MEWPs, there should be restraint systems as much as possible where feasible. And then having some form of competency oversight or qualified person oversight for those fall activities. And then electrical. Generator setups, we have to make sure that we follow the product installation requirements for generators. Also be mindful of this. I'm just going to put Honda out there because they're a really commonly used generator. Got to make sure that the appropriate model of Honda generators are selected for not only inverters, but also for delivery of grounding or GFCI. Uh, Honda does distinguish between their generators that are rated for OSHA compliance or for construction activities or outdoor activities versus their home products. They use the category of Honda generators, and I'm not advertising Honda, I'm just using them as an example, that is OSHA rated is EB, EB. So if you see the letters EB and then the serial number or the numbered series behind it, that is a uh, OSHA compliant or grounded or GFCI provided generator. They also have EUs, which look exactly like the EBs, but the EUs are really rated for inverters. So we got to be mindful of that. And there are so many other different products out there that are effective, but I just wanted to use that example because it's easy to get the wrong generator for the wrong activity. So make sure we got the right generators, make sure you have the temporary cords that are rated for outdoor use in harsh environments like you would encounter during a disaster operation. And then grounding and GFCI, we got to protect these individuals during their response. So grounding is not as practical in a lot of situations. So GFCI through a generator would be your most appropriate uh, mitigation for this type of hazard. Then let's talk about chemical health hazards. I am a CIH, so I can tell you that these things are commonly encountered depending on the type of response. So floodwater hazards, you may deal with infections from exposure. You deal with leptospirosis from dirty water or contaminated water. You could deal with hepatitis A as well from contamination, or even typhoid. There's also insects and animals that we have to be concerned about with rabies, dengue fever, West Nile virus, whatever. Okay, there are transmittable diseases that can come from these insects. With rabies, if you suspect if someone has an animal bite, get them care immediately. Wash the wound, get them to seek medical help because rabies intervention is critical within the first few hours before symptoms start showing up. Okay, so animal bites are definitely a concern in this type of environment. Okay, building materials. You have asbestos, you have lead, you have silica, you have mold. When things are impacted by water in a warm environment like what we encounter during a storm, We have to be mindful of mold. We also have to be mindful of carbon monoxide potentially as a concern, and H2S and methane, and also liquefied natural gas, so propane, and those kind of things we have to be mindful of. Okay, so those are the hazards of concern. I'm going to breeze through the remaining slides to allow time for questions and answers. But you know, the damage assessment of, you know, this is an example of a demolition activity from a home that was impacted by a storm. All of the hazards that I just went through with you is encountered right in this photo here. So we have to be prepared, and we have to safely assess damage without putting people in harm's way. Okay, if you need to use technology like drones, drones are typically the best approach to doing assessments and evaluations post-storm, okay, without impacting people. Then we have to get into the rebuilding of the infrastructure. We have to get into construction efforts to return the community back to its pre-storm condition. So rebuilding critical infrastructure is going to be the next phase of disaster recovery. So we stabilize where we can, we clean up where we can, we get people make ready, and then we start bringing back our communities. So that's what the resilience efforts are critical here. And then supporting effective communities. It's the mental health part of this that's also important. People have lost things. Community responders, first responders know these people that have lost things. They probably have lost things as well. They've lost their home, but they are there helping others. That becomes a taxing event for the responders and the community. So we have to have adequate emergency responses, mental health services available, not just the physical health part of it, but also the mental health. So we couple triage and medical response with mental health responses. Having both side by side will help the community recover faster. Okay, so long-term strategies for resilience. Business restoration. It is important that we get the business infrastructure back up and running as quickly as possible. We also look at how we can employ people faster. People lost their jobs. They don't have their creature comforts. They don't have the things that made them whole before. So getting them back to work helps with the recovery efforts. It also helps with the financial stability. So reinvesting back into those communities to get it up and running is part of that effort. Okay, and then as I mentioned, mental health and community support, very big on this. It's important that we get the mental health support as quickly as possible. And then mitigating future risk. You know, become an active member of your community and ask the questions. Are we resilient against future impacts? Whether it be sea level rise, whether it be tsunami threats, whether it be earthquake, hurricane, tornado threats, being an active member of the community and engaging in how do we respond to these and how do we prepare our community for these is the final step in the stage of recovery. So with that, I conclude. We've talked about comprehensive, you know, we got to have comprehensive planning in place. We got to have swift action, and then we have to have long-term resilience. I apologize for the little error there with the overlap, but I hope you get the point there. And I do want to say something. Yes, we can make the material quickly available to you. That shouldn't be an issue. Jim, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joaquin. We really appreciate that. Let's take a look. We didn't get a lot of questions in the chat. We did get a lot of positive comments about the presentation, so we appreciate that, Joaquin.
Thank you.
Um, the most common question we got was about receiving a copy of the presentation. We're not going to be able to distribute a copy of the presentation to everyone, but we did record the webinar. We plan on making that recording available to the public. I would imagine that likely will be posted to Department of Labor's YouTube channel, and we'll have a link to that recording available on OSHA.gov.
All right, perfect.
And a couple, just making sure nothing else came in, a couple of questions, Joaquin, for you. Um, let's see, the first question is how should health and safety concerns be addressed related to skin contact and inhalation after chemical spills that may have been upriver and have been moved down by the water into an area and now become part of the dried sediment? How should concerns be addressed related to skin contact and inhalation?
Okay, it's dependent on what the potential chemical spills are upstream, depending on the community you live in, and depending on the quantities of chemicals. A lot of that information is public record because it has to be disclosed to the regulatory agencies that manage, like the EPA or what have you. That's one element of it. The other way to look at it is putting people in protective suits, impermeable suits. The challenge with that would be the heat concerns and how do you manage the heat concerns. But the that would be one approach. The other would be to safe off the area until we have a further understanding of what the hazards are associated with that chemical. Even doing a survey of what is what is the leaching potential, what is the skin contact potential, but also what's the airborne potential as we disrupt the soil or as we attempt to clean the water. It's not always not all chemicals, well, all chemicals don't harm people the same way. So there are chemicals out there that are deadly that you could get on your skin and nothing happens. There are chemicals that if you take a sip of it after touching it, uh, can kill you or can harm you. So it's totally dependent on the chemical, getting access to what that chemical is, getting the safety data sheets, before you do anything with that chemical that's spilled.
Okay, thank you. The next question we have in the chat was clarification between the 4 foot and 6 foot height to provide fall protection for workers on site.
Yeah, that's a good one. I am a proponent of 0 feet fall protection. So someone could slip and fall and hit their head and suffer a traumatic brain injury from that, uh, what have you. So I think it would totally be dependent on the activity itself, what you're doing. I think it also is dependent on the state. Like in Washington State, they have a 4 foot across the board. It could depend on the risk appetite of that organization and of the responders. But I think it's totally dependent on your structure. If there's an incident command and everyone is in agreement that 4 feet would be the appropriate approach, or even 0 feet or 6 feet, then that's the approach you could take. I listed six because generally when we're talking about this type of response where we have to demolish buildings and things like that, that's generally construction related activities. So the 6 foot rule in that case would be applicable for that. But it's a starting point. It's not the end point. You could always make adjustments lower if there's an appetite to do that. Good
Okay.
question.
And Joaquin, next question. In a building with asbestos that has flooded, what safety precautions should be taken before entering?
Well, the flooding, if the material is still wet, that's helpful because the hazard with asbestos is when it becomes airborne. if it's a friable material, things like that. The best thing to do is to not allow access into that. I think we have to treat it like we would a normal asbestos environment. We got to set up a containment because it's not only an occupational hazard, but it's an environmental pollutant. So we need to contain as much as we need to contain all of it actually. So securing that structure and getting an appropriately trained group to go in there and set up the protective systems around that structure before you do anything, because you have to make these safe. And so if there is a contaminant within that home or that building, we don't do anything until we make it safe. So that's just my thought on that.
Okay, thank you, sir. I'll take the next question for you, Joaquin. It is, what other resources could you provide us? So if anyone has any further questions regarding hurricane response, please visit osha.gov/hurricane. And that's a landing page with some links to resources on the subject. So osha.gov/hurricane. And if you want to know more about the training that's available at our OTI education centers, please go to osha.gov/OTIEC. osha.gov/OTIEC. And I think that's all we're going to have time for right now. So this will conclude today's webinar. I would like to thank Joaquin and our partners at UCSD, Stephanie Spann and Stephanie McGilfrey, for helping us deliver this important information today. And I'd like to thank you all for joining. And to Joaquin and all the rest of the veterans on the call, thank you for your service and enjoy your Veterans Day weekend. Take
Thank
care,
you for
everybody.
your service, Jim. I
Thanks, sir.
really appreciate it. Thank you. Take care, everyone.